The medieval landscape of cleanliness unfolds slowly, like a town waking at dawn. Gates, creek carts roll over cobbles, a river moves past walls and mills, and the routines that keep bodies clothing and streets passably clean begin without fanfare. Cleanliness in this world does not mean sterility. It means management of water smells wastes and the expectations of neighbors who share narrow lanes and shared courtyards. People wash their faces and hands at ewers set on boards or at public fountains where women draw water into glazed jugs. A barber surgeon prepares a basin to shave a merchant before market. A laundress kneads linen in a trough with warm lye. A novice in a cloister rinses his hands in a stone lavabo before the midday meal. In cities and villages alike, water is both blessing and hazard clean, at its spring compromised as it travels redirected through rills, buckets, conduits, and channels that serve drink, cooking craft, and waste. The town attempts a kind of order sources for drawing places for washing, and ways to move used water away, sometimes swiftly through a steep lane, sometimes slowly through a ditch that sours in summer. The river is the persistent backdrop, transport fishery mill, power and sink. People who live beside it know its moods, clear freshets after rain, sluggish eddies under heat winter freshets that scour banks and carry filth seaward. Municipal life answers with small rules and stubborn habits. There are market days when inspectors pass and note who leaves refuse at the doorway. There are fines for tossing offal into lanes, regulations for swine that roam and create their own disorder instructions, to keep gutters scoured and to roof privies that hang over water. The fact endures in parchment and complaint. Late medieval towns across Europe, from London to Lubeck and Siena to Paris, issue ordinances that task residents with cleaning in front of their houses and forbid dumping dung in the street. A steady admission that cleanliness here is an ongoing negotiation rather than a settled triumph. At the same time, households and workshops layer their own practices. Floors are strewn with rushes or herbs, and changed at intervals, not daily but not never. Rushes absorb spills and soften the cold, and their renewal marks the turning of seasons or the arrival of guests. Linen, next to the skin, is prized for how it can be washed more often than wool, so the body is partly laundered by laundering clothing, and a clean shift after sweat is felt as relief. Soap exists soft in the north, where fats and wood ash yield a pliant paste, harder in the Mediterranean, where olive oil and soda ash create firm bars. The lesser-known detail is that certain towns specialize in distinct soaps, Proto-Castile and Ligurian varieties shipped in small loaves valued by households that can afford them, and mixed into warm water for scouring cuffs, collars, and caps. Public bathhouses present in many towns need not be imagined as uniform luxuries or dens of vice. They are workaday places where laborers sweat and soak. Travelers wash off road dust, and married couples rent a room with a tub and a fire to heat water. Their reputation varies with time and place and moral commentary, but their function is straightforward. They offer controlled warmth and plenty of water. In quieter districts, people bathe at home in wooden tubs drawn near the fire when seasons permit. Monasteries stand apart, not because they are modern, but because they are organized rules. Schedule washing of hands and feet, mandate clean linen for the liturgy, and arrange for regular but not luxurious bathing. The lavabo before refectory doors becomes a site of ordered cleanness, a reminder that ritual and hygiene mingle where water is scarce and shared. If cleanliness demands water, it also demands the removal of waste. Towns across the centuries hire rakers to collect refuse and employ night soil workers to empty cesspits, unseen, necessary, and skilled at moving what smells. Latrines attached to houses drop into pits that are lined and capped. When full, they are empty, their contents carted beyond walls or to fields sometimes spread as manure. Archaeology later will find parasite eggs in those pits, tokens of a reality people understand viscerally but not microscopically. Filth makes illness more likely, though the reasons are framed less in invisible life than in air that stinks, dampness that chills, and humors thought to be thrown out of balance. Theories of disease tell people what to fear and what to cultivate. They value fresh air, sweet smells, and moderation. They fear stagnant water rot and the miasma that seems to rise from unclean alleys. Scented hand waters with rosemary or lavender are poured over fingers at meals in well-appointed homes. Incense sweetens churches. Pomanders carry spice through crowded streets. These are not superstitions alone, but sensory rules for living in dense places without pipes or drains. The unresolved mystery that trails modern readers, how often did ordinary people truly bathe, remains without a single number. Records speak most often of the wealthy, the regulated, and the scandalous. Silence surrounds the routine. What emerges instead is rhythm, more frequent washing of hands and face, periodic bathing shaped by season cost and access, and careful attention to linen. In summers of abundance and mildness, bathhouses thrive. In years of plague or fear, they shudder or become suspect. In northern winters, steam fogs the beams of a bath. In mountain villages, a basin and cloth suffice. Cleanliness moves with the weather, the wage, and the work at hand. The wider earth sets the terms. Across the centuries commonly called the High Middle Ages, and their aftermath, climate drifts from relative warmth toward chill. The medieval warm period eases grain in some regions and swells populations, and later cool shifts and erratic rains stress harvests, crowd grain lofts with worry, and alter rivers' behavior. This planetary scale observation matters for hygiene because water regimes change floods, flush or foul. Droughts concentrate use at fewer points. Firewood for heating baths becomes dearer in hard years. Soap ingredients reflect trade winds and harvests far away. A coastal storm alters a harbor's channels, and waste that once washed clean now lingers behind a new sandbar. In all this, medieval cleanliness appears pragmatic rather than indifferent. People care about being presentable in church and marketplace, about good smells at table, about the comfort of warm water when it can be had. They complain about neighbors who foul shared spaces because those spaces are vital. They devise rules for swine street sweeping and the hours when rakers pass. They learn to draw water upstream of a tannery's drain. They pace their days with small ablutions, hands before meals, faces on waking feet after travel. They tolerate much that modern cities would pipe away because they must, and set a surprising number of boundaries against what they cannot tolerate because they live together in tight quarters. At the edges of town, fields receive the city's refuse and return food. In craft quarters, water darkens with dye and then clears in the river's midstream. In a cloister garden, a channel trickles through herbs, a crisp sound of order against the world's mingled scents. The medieval landscape of cleanliness is not a shock so much as a system composed of many small acts that add up to a livable place, imperfect and adaptable, guided by rules that are often broken and reinstated, and attentive to water's path from spring to cup to gutter to sea. Water sources and their challenges shape daily life across the medieval world. Every settlement depends on access to clean water, but what clean means in practice varies according to season, geography, and custom. Springs are prized most of all for their flow is steady and cool, their taste often sweeter than surface water. A town fortunate enough to sit above a reliable spring will protect it with a stone curb and canopy, sometimes consecrated with a cross, and sometimes fitted with carved spouts where women servants and apprentices gather each morning with buckets and pitchers. Wells come next in value. Dug deep into soil and rock, they are lined with timber or stone to keep them from collapse. A bucket descends on a rope, often creaking on a wooden frame. These wells serve entire households, and sometimes entire neighborhoods, but their water is vulnerable, a cesspit dug. Too close, or runoff from a tannery yard may seep through porous soil. Medieval towns understand the danger without modern microbiology. Complaints and ordinances survive that warn against situating latrines or refuse heaps near wells. There are records of wells closed or condemned of neighbors disputing rights to draw from a source that once seemed endless. Rivers and streams provide abundance, but also the greatest challenge. A river flowing through a city is a thoroughfare for transport, a source for fish, a power for mills, and at the same time a sink for waste. In Florence, Paris, or London, the same water that turns millstones receives dye from clothmakers' blood from butchers, and refuse from households. People who live downstream draw water less willingly, yet still they draw. A small channel diverted from the river may serve as a conduit into the town lined with stone, sometimes covered but never wholly separate from the wider flow of life. Archaeological evidence shows pipes of hollowed wood or carved stone moving water into courtyards or public fountains. Cities like London, Nuremberg, or Bruges experiment with such conduits, and wealthy institutions or guilds pay for their maintenance. These systems are fragile. A blocked channel, a broken pipe, a polluted source turns them into hazards as quickly as benefits. Rainwater, too, is collected when possible, caught from roofs into cisterns or barrels. In dry or elevated places, it provides the purest supply free from the constant mixing of river trade. But it is seasonal, stored in pits that must be cleaned and kept free of debris. When summer drought lingers, cisterns run low and people return to rivers. Here lies the paradox. Medieval people know well that water can carry sickness. Chroniclers remark on outbreaks following the drinking of foul water. Physicians advise choosing springs over rivers, clear streams over stagnant pools. Yet practice often yields to necessity. A washerwoman scrubs linen on flat stones at the riverbank because water is plentiful there, even if her neighbor pours waste a little upstream. A brewer needs great quantities for ale, and so draws where carts can reach. A shepherd fills a trough for his flock without regard for who else might drink later. The lesser-known detail is the degree to which craft and trade depend on precise qualities of water. Fullers need soft water to cleanse wool. Dyers require particular mineral contents to fix colors. Brewers prize water with a balance of salts that flavor the brew. Entire districts develop reputations for water suited to one craft, and disputes over access are as much about economy as health. A guild may petition the council to guarantee them a supply upstream of other uses or to fine those who alter a channel. In this way, water quality becomes a civic as well as a household concern. The unresolved mystery is how effective these regulations truly were. Ordinances are repeated year after year, suggesting chronic disobedience. Were wells truly protected from seepage? Did fines deter tanners and butchers from fouling rivers? Evidence points in both directions. Some towns maintained water systems for centuries, indicating competence and care. Others saw repeated failures, especially during plague years when fear magnified suspicion of water as a carrier of invisible poison. Theories of miasma, bad air, explained sickness more than water itself. Yet water was implicated when it smelled or stood stagnant. People sought to cover conduits, keep fountains flowing, and prefer running streams over still pools. A planetary scale observation is that climate fluctuations altered water challenges dramatically. During the medieval warm period, rivers often ran strong and wells were more reliable. As the Little Ice Age approached in the late Middle Ages, harsher winters froze water supplies and unpredictable rains brought floods that scoured channels or collapsed well linings. Drought years forced towns into rationing. In mountainous regions, snowmelt determined spring flow. In coastal towns, saltwater intrusion could spoil a well after storms shifted dunes or estuaries. Across Europe, water's availability was not fixed, but moved with Earth's wider rhythms, reminding each generation that control was provisional. Yet daily life persisted with routines that balanced knowledge and compromise. People drew water at dawn to avoid the press of neighbors, guarded cisterns with locks, and placed barrels in shaded corners. Public fountains became social centers where news and gossip mingled with splashing. In villages, children carried pails slung on yokes, and shepherds learned to read the clarity of streams. Within castles, water was hauled laboriously up from rivers or stored in stone tanks. Within monasteries, channels were engineered with care, sometimes achieving a cleanliness beyond the towns outside. Everywhere water was both ordinary and sacred necessary, yet feared a substance whose purity could never be guaranteed, but whose absence was unthinkable. The medieval world lived with this ambiguity, constructing laws, rituals, and habits around a resource that sustained and threatened in equal measure, and in doing so revealed a civilization constantly negotiating with the very element that made its survival possible. Bathhouses and their mixed reputation form one of the most intriguing aspects of medieval hygiene, for they stand at the crossroads of necessity, comfort, morality, and suspicion. To step into a bathhouse in a European town around the 13th century is to enter a warm, steamy environment, a place humming with voices splashing water and the clatter of buckets against tubs. These establishments are not hidden luxuries for elites alone, but part of the fabric of urban life. Craftsmen weary from work, merchants returning from markets, travelers covered in road dust, and families seeking respite from cold winters all frequent them. In many towns, bathhouses are licensed by civic authorities and sometimes attached to inns where visitors can rent not only a room but also a soak. Inside, large tubs of wood are filled with water heated over fires. Some establishments maintain communal pools, shallow enough for sitting, deep enough to submerge. The water is warm rather than scalding, replenished by attendants who labor to carry fresh buckets. Steam rises to wooden rafters and condenses dripping back into the room, mingling the scents of herbs sometimes added to the bath sage thyme, or rosemary, meant to soothe muscles and sweeten the experience. Candles burn in sconces, shadows ripple on damp walls, and voices echo through mist. In this setting, people scrub, chat, and eat light meals. For many bathhouses serve food and drink to those who linger. The fact that many towns had bathhouses well into the 15th century challenges the assumption that medieval Europe rejected bathing outright. Archaeological and documentary evidence confirms their presence from Paris to Prague, from Cologne to London, often situated in districts known for social life. Bathing was neither exotic nor rare, but an expected part of urban existence. Yet over time their reputation grew mixed. Authorities worried about morality. Because men and women sometimes bathed together, though often in separate areas or on alternating days, bathhouses became associated with sexual license. Moralists warned against temptation linking these places to brothels or to frivolous luxury. Preachers thundered that too much bathing softened the body and weakened the soul. Civic councils occasionally ordered bathhouses closed during Lent or during outbreaks of disease, citing both religious discipline and public health. The lesser-known detail is that in some regions, bathhouses were closely tied to the medical profession. Physicians prescribe bathing for various ailments from skin conditions to digestive troubles. Bath attendants might add herbs or minerals to the water, creating early forms of therapeutic baths. Town records mention stew houses, where baths were combined with treatments like cupping or massage. Some monasteries maintain private bath facilities for the sick, reflecting an older tradition that connected water with healing. Thus, the same establishment could be seen as a place of vice by one observer and a place of cure by another. The unresolved mystery concerns the exact timeline of decline. Bathhouses were clearly active across much of Europe through the 14th and early 15th centuries, yet by the 16th, their presence had dwindled in many regions. Historians debate whether fear of syphilis, which spread across Europe at the end of the 15th century, accelerated their disappearance, or whether broader cultural shifts toward modesty and suspicion of shared spaces played a greater role. The evidence is uneven, with some towns retaining baths longer than others, and some regions, particularly in Central Europe, continuing the tradition well into early modern times. What is clear is that by the Renaissance, public bathhouses were far less common, replaced by more private practices of washing. On a planetary scale, the story of bathhouses is also shaped by resources and climate. Heating large volumes of water required firewood or charcoal, and in heavily populated areas, fuel grew costly as forests were cut for construction and industry. The availability of cheap fuel determined how long bathhouses could operate profitably. In Mediterranean regions, warmer climates made bathing more comfortable year-round, while in Northern Europe the chill of long winters made hot baths a welcome luxury, but an expensive one. The Little Ice Age that began in the late Middle Ages further complicated this balance, for colder winters demanded more heating, raising costs at the same time that fuel grew scarcer. Bathhouses were in this sense fragile institutions, dependent not only on culture and morality, but also on broader ecological rhythms. Yet for centuries they offered ordinary people moments of warmth, relief, and cleanliness. The experience of sitting in a tub with neighbors washing away grime, sipping wine or ale, and listening to the hum of voices must have been profoundly comforting in a world where daily labor was harsh and homes often lacked space for bathing. Bathhouses served as social hubs as much as hygiene facilities. Friendships and business connections were nurtured there. Couples sometimes celebrated marriages by bathing together, making the event festive and communal. Children splashed under the eyes of parents. The line between the functional and the convivial blurred. The mixed reputation of bathhouses thus reflects medieval ambivalence. Water was cleansing and healing, but public gathering in states of undress provoked unease. Pleasure and suspicion walked side by side. When authorities sought to close them during times of plague, claiming that steam and crowds spread illness, people lamented the loss of comfort. When preachers denounced them as sinful, others defended their necessity. The bathhouse remained caught in debate, not because its utility was doubted, but because its meanings were too many at once. Looking back, the image of a medieval bathhouse reveals a society that understood the body's needs, yet struggled to reconcile them with spiritual ideals and material limitations. In the soft glow of lamplight through clouds of rising steam, one can glimpse not only the practical act of washing, but also the human desire for warmth, for companionship, and for relief from labor. The persistence of bathhouses for centuries, despite moral opposition and economic challenge, testifies to their value. They are remembered not merely as curiosities, but as essential institutions in the hygiene landscape of the Middle Ages, places where necessity and pleasure met in water's embrace until shifting cultures and climates brought their gradual retreat. Daily washing habits in the Middle Ages were more frequent and varied than the modern imagination often allows, though they rarely meant full immersion in water. For most people, especially in towns and villages, the daily routine of cleanliness focused on what was visible and practical: the face, the hands, and the hair. At the start of the day, many washed their faces with water drawn from a jug poured into a basin or scooped from a bucket. Travelers' accounts, monastic rules, and household manuals confirm the expectation that one presented a clean face in public, both as a sign of respectability and as a simple way to refresh oneself before work. Hands, too, were washed repeatedly, not only in the morning, but before meals, after labor, and before religious rituals. At a wealthy household's table, water for hand washing was presented in a ewer with a basin sometimes perfumed with herbs. Guests rinsed fingers carefully, wiping them on cloths provided by servants. In humbler settings, a wooden bowl filled with water might be passed around, each person dipping in turn. Archaeological finds of basins, jugs, and small washing vessels across Europe indicate that hand washing was a common and expected practice. Hair was another focus of daily care. Combs made of bone wood or horn appear frequently in medieval excavations, sometimes ornately carved, sometimes simple. These combs served both to tidy appearance and to remove lice, which were a constant nuisance. People brushed and combed hair not only for vanity, but for hygiene, knowing that untended hair quickly attracted pests. Ointments and oils were sometimes applied, perfumed with rosemary or lavender, both to improve scent and to discourage insects. Even in monasteries where modesty shaped grooming, combing hair was considered proper and necessary. The fact that combs are found in nearly every archaeological context, from castles to peasant houses, reminds us that personal hygiene was not ignored, even if it was understood differently than today. Full-body bathing, however, was less frequent. A person might immerse themselves weekly, monthly, or only on special occasions depending on climate, water access, and cultural expectations. In warm weather, bathing outdoors in rivers or lakes was common, though towns often restricted it to protect water supplies. In winter, bathing at home required labor. Water had to be drawn heated over a fire and carried to a wooden tub. For most households, this was a rare undertaking done when necessary rather than daily. Still, records suggest that people bathed more often than the stereotype of the unwashed Middle Ages suggests. Festivals, weddings, and holy days often prompted bathing, as did health concerns. Physicians recommended washing the body to balance humors and preserve vigor, especially in moderation. Children, the sick, and travelers might be bathed more regularly out of concern for comfort and recovery. Clothing, particularly linen undergarments, played a vital role in everyday hygiene. Linen was prized for its ability to absorb sweat and be laundered more frequently than outer garments of wool. Changing into clean linen was considered refreshing even if the body itself was not bathed. This indirect form of cleanliness, washing the clothing that touched the skin, meant that many felt presentable without immersing themselves in water. The lesser-known detail here is that some households kept multiple sets of linen specifically for this purpose, with laundresses working constantly to boil and scrub garments. In cities, washerwomen often worked communally at riversides, pounding linen with wooden paddles, so that entire neighborhoods were tied to the rhythms of washing days. The unresolved mystery is how these habits varied across social classes and regions. Evidence is scattered. Chronicles describe the routines of nobles and clerics, but the practices of peasants are less well recorded. Did rural farmers wash as often as townsfolk, or did scarcity of water in some areas reduce their routines? Archaeology provides hints. Combs in village excavations, wash basins in modest houses. But the full picture remains uncertain. What is clear is that ideas of cleanliness were relative, shaped by expectations of community rather than by absolute standards. To appear at church, at market, or at a feast with unwashed hands or a dirty face would have drawn comment, while to bathe only occasionally drew no disapproval. On a planetary scale, the rhythms of washing were influenced by environment and climate. In Mediterranean regions, warm weather and abundant water encouraged more frequent bathing, often outdoors or in courtyard basins. In Northern Europe, cold winters made bathing less attractive, but long summer days often saw people wash in rivers or ponds. Periods of drought limited water supplies, reducing washing to the essentials, while floods and heavy rains might contaminate wells and force greater reliance on stored rainwater. Across centuries, climatic shifts like the medieval warm period and later the Little Ice Age altered how often people could access clean water for daily routines. Even these small-scale practices were part of a larger environmental dialogue between humans and the elements. Yet despite limitations, medieval people did not live in ignorance of hygiene. They valued the refreshment of clean hands, the comfort of combed hair, the dignity of presentable clothing. They associated washing with health ritual and hospitality. They taught children to rinse before eating and scolded servants for neglecting household washing duties. The everyday acts of dipping fingers into a basin, pouring water over a guest's hands, or combing through tangled hair were woven into the social fabric of the Middle Ages. To modernize, these routines may seem minimal, but within their context, they represented a consistent and thoughtful practice of daily hygiene, one that balanced effort, resources, and cultural meaning in a world where water was precious and labor costly, yet cleanliness remained a mark of civility and care. Clothing as a layer of hygiene offers one of the most revealing insights into how medieval people managed bodily cleanliness without constant bathing. At the heart of this system stood linen, the inner garment worn next to the skin by men and women alike. Unlike wool or leather, which were difficult to wash and easily damaged by boiling water, linen could be laundered repeatedly, scrubbed and bleached by sun. To change one's linen was to feel fresh, to put on a clean layer that absorbed sweat and oils, effectively washing the body indirectly. Archaeological finds, household records, and visual depictions all confirm the ubiquity of linen shirts, shifts, and chemises. A nobleman might own a dozen embroidered and fine, while a peasant might rotate only 2 or 3 patched and plain, but the principle was the same: linen served as a portable layer of hygiene. Outer garments of wool and fur could remain unwashed for long periods, protected from direct contact by the washable linen beneath. The fact of linen's centrality to hygiene is supported by the immense labor devoted to its care. Washerwomen filled riversides beating linen against stones or paddles, soaking garments in lye made from wood ash, and boiling them in large cauldrons. After washing, linen was stretched on grass to bleach in the sun, a process that not only whitened the fabric but also disinfected it with light. In urban centers, professional laundresses formed guild-like associations hired by households to manage the steady cycle of soiled linen. In castles and monasteries, entire staff positions were dedicated to laundry. Clean linen was a marker of social respectability. To appear in public with grimy or stained clothing risked reputational damage. A lesser-known detail is the medicinal and symbolic value attached to linen. Physicians sometimes prescribed wearing fresh linen shifts to promote health, believing that sweat and impurities would be drawn out of the body into the fabric. This belief reinforced the habit of frequent changes even when bathing was rare. Linen was also associated with purity in religious symbolism. Altar cloths, shrouds, and liturgical vestments were made from it, connecting daily hygiene with spiritual cleanliness. The wearing of white linen beneath garments carried connotations of moral as well as bodily order. The unresolved mystery lies in the frequency of laundering across classes and regions. Wealthy nobles clearly changed linen often as inventories list dozens of pieces, but how often peasants managed the same is debated. Some historians suggest that rural households laundered linen less frequently due to labor and fuel costs, while others point to archaeological finds of combs basins and soap-making tools, even in modest homes, suggesting that hygiene practices were more widespread. The truth may lie in a spectrum: frequent washing among elites and townsfolk, more seasonal cycles among peasants, but with shared values about the importance of clean linen nonetheless. What is certain is that linen was washed more often than the body itself, serving as the true interface of medieval hygiene. On a planetary scale, the production of linen tied cleanliness to agriculture and climate. Flax cultivation thrived in temperate zones with moist soil, particularly in regions like Flanders, northern France, and parts of Germany. The prosperity of these textile centers ensured a steady supply of linen, feeding both the clothing market and the hygiene system. Climatic shifts such as the medieval warm period favored flax yields, while colder, wetter conditions of the Little Ice Age strained production. Linen was also part of international trade, shipped across the Baltic and Mediterranean, its availability linked to broader economic and environmental rhythms. Thus, the simple act of changing a shirt was connected to patterns of cultivation, harvest, and commerce that stretched across continents. Beyond linen, other clothing played secondary roles in hygiene. Shoes protected feet from filth on streets where animals roamed and refuse was dumped. Hoods and caps shielded hair from lice or dirt, while gloves protected hands during work. These items were less often washed, but their presence reduced exposure to grime. The layering of garments created barriers between the body and the environment, each layer serving as a form of cleanliness. The relationship between clothing and hygiene also extended to odor. Medieval people were acutely sensitive to smells, believing foul odors carried disease. Perfumed sachets sewn into garments, herbs strewn in wardrobes, and scented oils applied to linen all helped mask or mitigate bodily smells. To wear clean, freshly laundered linen, fragrant from herbs or sunlight, was not only comfortable but socially significant, a way of signaling health and civility in crowded towns. Monastic communities illustrate the systematic approach to clothing and hygiene. Rules required brothers to have a minimum number of shifts, to change them regularly, and to keep them laundered. Laundry days were scheduled with novices assigned to assist. The cloistered life did not eliminate the need for cleanliness. Rather, it ritualized it, linking clean garments with spiritual discipline. In hospitals run by religious orders, patients were often given clean linen as part of their care, reinforcing the association between fresh clothing and healing. The wider world also offered variations. In Mediterranean cultures, lighter linen garments suited the climate and were washed more often, while in colder northern regions, heavier wool layers dominated with linen shifts hidden beneath. In Islamic Spain, where bathing traditions were stronger, linen complemented regular washing, while in Christian Europe, it sometimes substituted for immersion. Such differences remind us that medieval hygiene was not a single practice, but a patchwork shaped by climate, economy, and belief. Clothing, however, remained the common denominator. Clean linen could transform a person's sense of self, making them feel renewed even without a bath. Travelers' tales often remark on the comfort of being provided with fresh garments after long journeys, describing it as if the body itself had been cleansed. Kings and nobles displayed fine linen as part of their wealth, while peasants cherished the modest sets they owned. Across the spectrum, the principle was shared: to change linen was to reset the body's cleanliness. Ultimately, clothing reveals how medieval hygiene was practical, layered, and adaptive. It demonstrates that people were not indifferent to cleanliness, but managed it within the limits of resources and technology. The centrality of linen shifts shows a society that valued presentability, health, and ritual purity, even when daily bathing was impractical. From flax fields to laundries, from sun-bleached meadows to market stalls, the cycle of clothing linked body and environment in a quiet but constant rhythm. On any given morning in the Middle Ages, a man or woman pulling on a freshly laundered shirt was not only getting dressed, but participating in a system of hygiene that sustained communities for centuries, where fabric and water together kept the human body in balance with the world around it. Waste and urban sanitation formed one of the most pressing and persistent challenges of medieval life. For wherever people lived together in close quarters, refuse accumulated quickly. In towns and cities, streets were narrow, often unpaved and crowded with houses whose upper stories jutted over the lanes. Livestock such as pigs, goats, and chickens moved freely through markets, leaving droppings among straw and spilled grain. Artisans disposed of scraps from their trades. Tanners dumped lime-soaked hides. Butchers discarded blood and bones. Dyers emptied vats of colored water, all of which mingled with household waste and human refuse. To walk through a medieval street was to encounter a world thick with smells, sights, and sounds of constant use. Sanitation, therefore, became a civic as well as a household responsibility, though solutions were imperfect and uneven. Many towns appointed rakers or scavengers, men hired to cart away refuse. They worked at night or at dawn, collecting dung, ash, and kitchen waste into carts pulled beyond city walls. In some cases, the waste was sold to farmers as manure, a reminder that what was foul to one community could be valuable to another. Ordinances survive from London, Paris, and countless smaller towns setting fines for those who tipped waste into the street or blocked thoroughfares with refuse. Inspectors walked markets to ensure fishmongers and butchers cleaned their stalls and to keep vendors from dumping remains where people still shopped. These rules were repeated year after year, which itself tells a story. Enforcement was never perfect, and the struggle against filth was ongoing. Cesspits and privies were the primary solution for human waste. Many urban houses had small latrines opening into pits dug beneath or beside the building, sometimes lined with stone or timber to prevent collapse. When these pits filled, night soil, men were hired to empty them, working by lantern light with buckets and shovels. Their labor was unpleasant but necessary, and their services kept towns from drowning in their own refuse. In some places, waste was carried to fields and spread as fertilizer, linking the cycle of city and countryside. In others, it was dumped in designated pits, outside walls, or into rivers where currents carried it away. Latrines also appeared in communal forms. Monasteries often built large multi-seat latrines with running water channels beneath, designed to carry waste away. Castles sometimes constructed garderobes, stone closets that projected over moats or pits. In cities, public latrines existed at bridges or along quaysides, serving travelers and traders. These facilities, though crude by modern standards, were significant attempts to manage human needs in crowded environments. The lesser-known detail is the role of pigs as informal sanitation workers. In many towns, swine were allowed to roam the streets, consuming scraps and refuse. This practice alarmed authorities, for pigs could spread disease or cause injury, but their usefulness in reducing waste meant they persisted despite ordinances. Records from Paris in the 14th century note repeated attempts to ban pigs from the city, Yet they continued to appear, testifying to the difficulty of separating animals from human communities in a world where disposal services were limited. The unresolved mystery is how effective medieval sanitation truly was in preserving health. On one hand, repeated outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and other diseases suggest that waste management often failed. On the other, towns did not simply collapse under their own filth. People lived, worked, and thrived in them for centuries. Archaeological studies of cesspits reveal parasite eggs and evidence of contamination, but also layers showing that pits were cleaned and reused. Ordinances, though often ignored, still indicate a civic awareness of cleanliness and a desire to regulate behavior. The balance between order and disorder shifted constantly, with sanitation never wholly adequate, but never wholly absent. On a planetary scale, the problem of sanitation connected directly to rivers' rainfall and climate. Heavy rains could wash filth through streets and into wells, spreading contamination. Droughts made rivers sluggish, allowing waste to linger rather than be carried downstream. Floods sometimes inundated cesspits, spreading their contents across neighborhoods. Climatic shifts during the late Middle Ages made these problems more acute. Colder winters froze waste in place only to release it in spring thaws, while unpredictable rains made drainage systems unreliable. Cities along major rivers such as the Thames or the Seine constantly negotiated the dual nature of water as both cleanser and contaminant. Sanitation was also influenced by social expectations. In wealthier households, servants were tasked with removing chamber pots and keeping floors strewn with clean rushes or herbs. In poorer homes, pots might be emptied into the street at night, a practice immortalized in later cries of Gardylou in Northern Europe. Towns attempted to regulate when and how such dumping could occur, requiring residents to empty waste only at certain hours, but these rules were difficult to enforce. Smell was a constant companion in medieval towns, and people developed a tolerance for it that modern noses might find unthinkable. Yet they did not ignore it. They spread herbs, burned incense, and washed hands frequently to counteract it. Market squares in particular were kept under close watch, as civic pride demanded that central spaces remain at least passably clean. Even so, complaints about filth in alleys and behind workshops persisted in council records across centuries. The paradox of medieval sanitation lies in its combination of ingenuity and insufficiency. Towns organized waste collection, built conduits, and legislated against offenders. Yet the technology of the time could not achieve modern cleanliness. Instead, communities lived with cycles of order and disorder, moments when waste was under control, and others when it overwhelmed the streets. Farmers depended on city refuse to fertilize fields, making filth part of the agricultural economy. Civic pride demanded fountains, conduits, and paved market squares, while back alleys remained foul. Monasteries designed complex water systems, while villages relied on pigs and rakers. In every case, waste was not an ignored problem, but a shared and stubborn reality. The image of a medieval city at dawn captures this balance. Rakers push carts through still dark streets, collecting piles left overnight. Washerwomen begin their work at riverside scrubbing linen that will return freshness to households. Merchants sweep before stalls, scattering rushes to mask smells. A swine roots through scraps in a gutter. Bells ring for morning prayers, and people wash hands and faces, preparing to face another day in streets that will never be wholly clean but are constantly managed. Sanitation in the Middle Ages was never absolute, but always ongoing, a negotiation between human need, civic order, and the wider forces of climate and environment. Monastic cleanliness and ritual washing reveal a side of medieval hygiene that combines practicality with spirituality, showing how religious communities structured habits of cleanliness into the rhythm of daily life. Within monasteries, abbeys, and convents, water was not merely a necessity, but also a symbol of purity, renewal, and order. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed in many communities across Europe, prescribed routines for washing at set times. Monks were instructed to wash their hands before meals and after work, and to bathe on certain occasions often linked to liturgical calendars or times of illness. The architecture of monasteries reflects this concern. Cloisters often included a lavabo, a stone fountain or trough placed near the refectory where brothers lined up to rinse their hands before entering to eat. Carved basins, sometimes decorated with symbolic motifs, allowed water to flow continuously, ensuring that each person washed in fresh water rather than a stagnant pool. These lavabos, fed by diverted springs or aqueducts, became central features of cloistered life, uniting physical cleanliness with ritual preparation. Monastic latrines, too, show a surprising degree of organization. Known as reredoors, in some traditions, they were often large communal rooms with stone or wooden seats set over channels of running water designed to carry waste away. In Cistercian monasteries, these latrines were integrated into carefully planned water systems that also served mills, kitchens, and gardens. Archaeological excavations reveal sophisticated channels, sluices, and drains, evidence of the value placed on hygiene and order. Such systems exceeded what most townspeople could expect, reflecting the resources and planning available to monastic communities. The fact that monks and nuns engaged in more regular washing than the general populace is supported by documentary records. Bathing was not daily, but was scheduled sometimes weekly or monthly, depending on resources and climate. During times of heat or illness, rules permitted more frequent baths. Hospitals run by religious orders often included facilities for bathing patients, recognizing its role in comfort and healing. Thus, ritual and health were entwined with water, seen as both physically beneficial and spiritually cleansing. A lesser-known detail is the use of specific herbs and practices in monastic washing. Records mention that monks added rosemary, sage, or lavender to water for washing hands or bathing, both for fragrance and for perceived medicinal properties. In some communities, novices were trained in the preparation of these herbal infusions, linking hygiene with monastic knowledge of medicine and botany. Gardens cultivated by monks supplied the plants, creating a self-sustaining cycle of cleanliness and healing. Washing was not limited to the body. Monastic rules emphasized the laundering of clothing and bed linens, with assigned brothers responsible for maintaining cleanliness. Laundry days were regular, with linen boiled in cauldrons, scrubbed with ash-based soaps, and dried in cloister yards. This care for garments reflected both hygiene and discipline, reinforcing the sense that cleanliness was a communal duty as much as an individual act. The unresolved mystery lies in how far monastic practices influence broader society. Did the emphasis on hand-washing before meals, scheduled bathing, and organized latrines inspire towns to improve sanitation, or did monasteries remain isolated examples of higher standards? Some evidence suggests that monastic water systems influenced nearby settlements, as towns borrowed ideas for conduits and fountains. Yet the gap between cloister and street remained wide. Monastic life was exceptional, shaped by vows, discipline, and resources that ordinary people did not share. Still, the contrast demonstrates that medieval society did not lack awareness of cleanliness. Rather, its application depended on context and capacity. On a planetary scale, monastic water systems show how humans reshaped landscapes to sustain cleanliness. Many abbeys were deliberately built near springs or rivers, ensuring reliable water. Channels were cut through fields and forests, aqueducts laid across valleys and reservoirs constructed to store supplies. These alterations reveal a careful attention to geography, as monks chose sites where water could sustain not only agriculture but also sanitation. Climate played its role in wet regions. Channels had to be managed to avoid flooding. In drier areas, storage was critical. The ability of monasteries to maintain cleanliness was tied directly to their success in harnessing natural water flows. Beyond the physical ritual, washing reinforced the connection between body and spirit. Before entering the church, monks often rinsed hands and faces. On certain holy days, feet were washed in ceremonies that imitated Christ's washing of his disciples' feet, emphasizing humility and purity. These acts blended hygiene with devotion, reminding participants that cleanliness was not only practical but symbolic of inner renewal. To neglect washing was not merely slovenly but spiritually careless. The rhythm of monastic life prayer, work-study washing created a steady alternation between the sacred and the ordinary, each reinforcing the other. In daily practice, the sound of water flowing through cloisters was constant, a soft background to chants and silence. The sight of brothers washing side by side, the feel of cool water poured from a jug, the fragrance of herbs in basins. All these moments shaped a collective experience of cleanliness. The memory of such order impressed visitors who often remarked on the neatness and hygiene of monasteries compared to towns. This perception endured, creating a legacy in which monastic cleanliness became part of Europe's cultural imagination of order and sanctity. In some, monastic cleanliness illustrates how medieval people could integrate hygiene into a broader worldview. It was not incidental but central, designed into architecture, codified in rules, and infused with symbolism. The fact of organized lavabos and latrines shows technical ingenuity. The lesser-known detail of herbal washing highlights monastic knowledge. The unresolved mystery of influence reminds us that cloisters were both connected to and apart from society. The planetary scale of water management ties this story to rivers, climates, and landscapes reshaped by human hands. Through these layers, ritual washing in monasteries stands as a testament to how cleanliness could embody both survival and spirituality in the Middle Ages. Plagues, smells, and theories of disease in the Middle Ages reveal how deeply hygiene was bound to ideas of health fear and the unseen forces believed to govern the body. When epidemics swept through Europe, most famously, the Black Death of the 14th century, people searched for explanations. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, they turned to what senses and tradition told them: that foul odors, rotting matter, and stagnant air were dangerous. The concept of miasma, or bad air, dominated medical thought. Physicians and scholars believed that diseases spread through poisonous vapors released from decaying material swamps, or even from celestial events that disturbed the balance of the atmosphere. In crowded cities where smells were unavoidable, this belief created a heightened sensitivity to odor. Streets heavy with refuse tanneries, producing sharp stench, and fish markets in summer heat were all seen as potential breeding grounds of illness. The fact that strong smells were thought harmful led people to counteract them with stronger, sweeter ones. Herbs, flowers, and spices became tools of protection. During meals, guests washed hands with scented waters infused with rosemary or lavender. In churches, incense filled the air, creating a fragrant atmosphere that was not only symbolic but also thought to repel harmful vapors. Wealthier households carried pomanders, small perforated balls filled with cloves, musk, or ambergris clutched to the nose when passing through crowded streets. Even doctors, when treating plague victims, wore beak-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs intended to filter the air. A lesser-known detail is that some towns organized official fumigations during epidemics. Fires of juniper or pine were set to cleanse the air with smoke, while streets were sprinkled with vinegar or rose water. Bells were rung both as a spiritual act and as a way to stir the air, dispersing what was thought to be stagnant poison. These acts demonstrate the seriousness with which medieval people confronted the invisible threats they perceived, even if their understanding was framed differently from modern science. Waste and smell were directly tied to theories of disease. Ordinances against dumping refuse into streets were not only about civic order but also about protecting health. Officials recognized that filth bred bad air and therefore sickness. Yet paradoxically, certain practices such as allowing pigs to roam and eat scraps remained common tolerated as a form of crude sanitation despite their own smells. This tension between theory and necessity shaped urban hygiene for centuries. The unresolved mystery concerns how people themselves experience these conditions day to day. Chronicles describe plagues in vivid terms, but they rarely record the ordinary smells of daily life or how individuals judge them. Did people grow accustomed to constant odors, noticing only when they worsened, or were they always keenly aware archaeology uncovers cesspits filled with layers of waste confirming conditions that must have smelled intensely? But the subjective experience of living among them is harder to reconstruct. What is clear is that smell carried cultural meaning. It was linked to morality as well as health. Pleasant smells suggested cleanliness and virtue. Foul smells suggested sin, disorder, or corruption. On a planetary scale, plague itself was not confined to Europe, but part of wider environmental and ecological systems. The Black Death spread from Asia, carried by fleas on rodents that traveled along trade routes and devastated populations from China to the Mediterranean. Climate fluctuations played a role. Colder winters and wetter summers disrupted harvests, driving rodents closer to human settlements and making communities more vulnerable to famine and disease. The miasma theory, though mistaken, was at least a recognition that environment and health were connected. People understood that air, water, and cleanliness influenced survival, even if the mechanisms remained hidden. Everyday practices reflected these beliefs. Streets were sprinkled with rushes and herbs to counter odors, privies were covered, and cesspits emptied when smells grew unbearable. Market inspectors patrolled to ensure spoiled meat or fish was not sold, aware that such goods could sicken buyers. Physicians recommended moderation in diet, fresh air, and the avoidance of foul places as preventive measures. During plagues, processions of prayer wound through cities accompanied by clouds of incense seeking both spiritual and sensory protection. Ritual washing before meals, hand waters scented with herbs, and the use of perfumed linens all took on added weight when illness was near. Smell thus became both diagnosis and defense. To detect a foul odor was to sense danger, and to surround oneself with pleasant aromas was to guard against it. This worldview shaped not only hygiene but also architecture and urban planning. Wealthy patrons funded fountains that delivered flowing water believed to refresh both body and air. Monasteries cultivated herb gardens that supplied both medicine and fragrance. City councils paved central streets to reduce filth and improve airflow. Though limited by technology, these measures reveal a constant negotiation with the environment, guided by the conviction that cleanliness of place and freshness of air were essential to health. The story of plagues and smells in the Middle Ages is therefore not one of ignorance but of interpretation. People observed patterns, sickness followed, foulness, cleanliness brought relief. Their explanations differed from ours, but their responses, washing, cleaning, perfuming, regulating, were practical within their framework. The fact of repeated ordinances shows persistent civic concern. The lesser-known detail of fumigation highlights inventive if misguided strategies. The unresolved mystery of daily sensory experience reminds us of the limits of sources, and the planetary scale of plague demonstrates how local hygiene connected to global forces of trade, climate, and ecology. In the dim streets of medieval towns, where the fragrance of rosemary water might mingle with the stench of waste, people lived with constant awareness of smell as a marker of safety or peril. They washed hands, laundered linen, burned incense, and feared the invisible poisons they believed lurked in air. Though their theories of disease were incomplete, their practices reveal a society deeply attuned to the links between cleanliness, health, and survival in a fragile and interconnected world. Regional variations in hygiene across the medieval world reveal a spectrum of practices shaped by climate, resources, religion, and cultural traditions. To imagine a single medieval hygiene is misleading, for what was considered clean in one region might be unusual in another. In Northern Europe, where winters were long and fuel was costly, bathing was infrequent but the laundering of linen was common, serving as a substitute for full immersion. Rivers and streams provided water, but their icy cold limited outdoor washing for much of the year. Instead, households emphasized hand-washing, combing hair, and keeping clothing fresh. Soap made from animal fat and wood ash was produced in local workshops, though it was harsh and used sparingly. Scandinavian sources mention sweat baths, precursors to the modern sauna, where families or communities gathered in wooden huts heated by stones, then cooled off by plunging into rivers or rolling in snow. This pattern of heat, sweat, and cleansing offered both physical relief and a social gathering, demonstrating how climate shaped hygiene rituals. In contrast, the Mediterranean world, with its warmer climate and different cultural influences, maintained stronger traditions of bathing. Roman bathhouses had long since declined, but the idea of communal bathing persisted in various forms. In Italy, southern France, and Spain, public and private baths were more common than in the north. Here, olive oil played a role in cleansing rubbed on the skin and scraped away with strigils, a practice inherited from antiquity and still seen in some communities. Soap, too, was more refined, made with olive oil and soda ash to produce smoother varieties. Water was more readily available from aqueduct cisterns and fountains, and the warm climate made bathing less arduous. In Islamic Spain, the influence of Arab culture preserved and enriched bathing traditions. Hammams, or steam baths, stood as prominent features of cities like Córdoba and Granada. They followed a sequence of warm, hot, and cold rooms where visitors washed, relaxed, and socialized. Hygiene in this context was deeply tied to religious practice, for Islam emphasized ritual ablution before prayer. Washing hands, faces, and feet several times daily was a spiritual obligation as well as a physical refreshment. Hammams provided a structured setting for both, making regular bathing more accessible and socially embedded than in much of Christian Europe. The fact of such regional differences is clear in both records and archaeology. Bathhouse remains are abundant in the Mediterranean and Islamic world, while Northern Europe shows more reliance on linen saunas and sporadic baths. A lesser-known detail is the persistence of Celtic and Slavic bathing traditions in rural Europe. In parts of Ireland and Eastern Europe, hot baths or sweat huts remain common, tied to older ritual practices as well as practical hygiene. Chronicles by outside observers sometimes describe these customs with fascination or disdain, but they reveal that medieval Europe was never uniform in its approach to cleanliness. The unresolved mystery is the degree to which these regional practices influenced one another through travel, trade, and cultural exchange. Did Northern Europeans adopt bathing habits from Southern travelers? Or did Mediterranean merchants alter their linen use after contact with northern cities? The evidence is fragmentary, though records of bathhouses in northern towns during the 13th and 14th centuries suggest that southern customs did spread. Conversely, the use of linen as a primary hygienic layer expanded southward, carried by trade in textiles. On a planetary scale, the distribution of hygiene practices was tied to climate zones and resource availability. Olive trees in the Mediterranean provided oil for soap, while northern forests supplied ash and fat for harsher varieties. Water abundance in some regions allowed for baths and fountains, while scarcity in others made daily immersion impractical. Climate fluctuations also altered habits during warmer centuries. Bathing may have been more common even in northern Europe, while colder periods reduced it. Trade connected these differences, moving soap, linen, herbs, and perfumes across vast distances, weaving hygiene into the economic web of medieval life. Urban versus rural differences added another layer. In cities where populations were dense, regulation of waste and the presence of bathhouses or fountains shaped hygiene. In rural villages, streams, ponds, and wells were the primary resources, and customs varied with geography. A farmer might wash in a stream after labor, while his clothing was laundered less often due to limited access to soap and fuel. Yet the principles of cleanliness, washing hands, combing hair, maintaining linen remained consistent across regions, even if the scale and style differed. Religion also shaped variation. Christianity did not emphasize ritual ablution in the same way as Islam, but it valued symbolic washing in sacraments such as baptism. Monastic communities with their rules of hand washing and scheduled baths stood apart from lay society. Judaism, present in many medieval towns, also carried traditions of ritual bathing, with mikvehs established for purification. Thus, alongside climate and economy, faith traditions contributed to the mosaic of hygiene practices. The sensory world of these regions also differed. In Mediterranean towns, the scent of olive oil, soap, and herbs filled bathhouses. In northern villages, the smoky heat of saunas blended with the sharp smell of pine or juniper used in cleaning. In Islamic Spain, steam baths infused with rosewater or orange blossoms created a fragrant atmosphere. Each region developed its own sensory vocabulary of cleanliness, reinforcing cultural identity through smell, touch, and ritual. Regional variations remind us that medieval hygiene was adaptive, responsive to environment, and shaped by diverse traditions. The fact of widespread linen use in the north, hammams in the south, and sweat huts in the east reveals a continent of multiple solutions to the same challenge. The lesser-known detail of local bathing traditions underscores continuity with pre-Christian practices. The unresolved mystery of cross-cultural influence highlights the limits of evidence. The planetary scale of climate and trade ties all these practices into a broader story of human adaptation. To move across medieval Europe was to move between worlds of hygiene, from the steam of a Scandinavian sauna to the cool basin of a monastic lavabo, from the olive-scented hammam of Cordoba to the linen-clad markets of Bruges. Each was different, yet all reveal a shared human effort to keep body and spirit refreshed amid the demands of medieval life. From medieval practices to early modern shifts, the story of hygiene becomes one of continuity and change, where familiar habits persist, but gradually give way to new understandings of health, disease, and the body. In the 13th and 14th centuries, public bathhouses were still present in many towns. Laundresses still scoured linen at riversides, and ordinances still regulated the disposal of waste. Yet by the 16th century, many of these customs were changing. The decline of bathhouses is one of the clearest transformations. Once social hubs of warmth, cleanliness, and conviviality, they came to be associated with disease and immorality. The arrival of syphilis in Europe around 1500 deepened suspicions. Physicians warned that heat and steam open the pores of the body, making it more vulnerable to infection. Authorities closed or restricted bathhouses, sometimes permanently, and what had once been common urban institutions became rarer. In their place, more private forms of washing grew in importance. The washing of hands, faces, and especially linen continued, but the idea of immersion in shared water became suspect. This does not mean people became dirtier, but that the ways they pursued cleanliness shifted toward the domestic and the private. Clothing retained its central role. Linen undergarments continued to be prized, and as textile production expanded with the growth of the early modern economy, more households gained access to greater quantities of cloth. The laundress remained a familiar figure in cities, though her work was increasingly tied to households rather than to communal spaces like rivers. Soap production also expanded. In Mediterranean regions, centers like Marseille and Castile produced hard soaps from olive oil and soda ash shipped across Europe. In Northern Europe, softer soaps made from animal fats remained common, but trade brought southern varieties to new markets. Clean linen washed with soap and scented with herbs became an even more visible sign of civility and refinement. The fact of soap's spread illustrates how economic and technological change altered hygiene practices in ways subtle but significant. A lesser-known detail is the rise of perfume waters and cosmetics in this period. Distillation techniques refined by alchemists and apothecaries allowed the production of rose water, orange blossom water, and later alcohol-based perfumes. These liquids were used to wash hands and face, both refreshing the skin and leaving a pleasant scent. The emphasis on fragrance reflects the persistence of miasma theory. Pleasant smells were still thought to protect against disease. Yet it also reveals a cultural shift toward associating refinement and social grace with bodily presentation, a prelude to modern notions of personal grooming. The unresolved mystery concerns how ordinary people adapted to these shifts. Did peasants and townsfolk abandon bathhouses entirely? Or did small local baths persist quietly even as larger institutions closed? Evidence is uneven. Some cities, particularly in Central Europe, retained bathhouses well into the 17th century. In rural areas, bathing in rivers or using small tubs at home surely continued. What is clear is that the overall cultural climate grew more suspicious of communal bathing, even if the practice never disappeared completely. On a planetary scale, climate and disease both drove these changes. The onset of the Little Ice Age in the late Middle Ages brought colder winters and harsher seasons. Heating large baths became more costly, encouraging their decline. At the same time, waves of epidemic disease from plague to syphilis reinforced the idea that bathing could expose rather than protect the body. European expansion overseas also introduced new goods that influenced hygiene. Spices, herbs, and later tobacco altered the sensory world, adding new ways to mask or alter bodily smells. The early modern era thus marked a turning point where hygiene began to be reconceived, even if practices evolved gradually. Urban sanitation remained imperfect, but saw efforts at improvement. Cities paved more streets, installed new conduits, and enforced ordinances with varying degrees of success. Wealthy patrons funded public fountains as symbols of civic pride, ensuring cleaner water supplies for their communities. Monastic traditions of organized washing influenced hospitals and schools, where regular ablutions were encouraged. Yet problems persisted. Cesspits overflowed, waste was dumped into rivers, and smells remained a constant companion. What shifted most was perception. Increasingly, cleanliness became associated not only with health, but with morality and social status. To appear clean and fragrant marked one as refined. To appear dirty and smelly marked one as lowly or uncivilized. This association laid the foundation for later ideas of politeness and civility in the 17th and 18th centuries. It also widened the gap between elite and common practice, as wealthy households could afford more linen soap and perfumes, while poorer families relied on simpler measures. In households, rituals of washing grew more elaborate. Morning routines included wiping the face with cloths soaked in scented waters, combing hair with ornate combs, and donning freshly laundered garments. Servants presented basins and towels echoing the hand-washing customs of medieval feasts, but now embedded in daily life. Manuals of etiquette described how to wash discreetly and maintain cleanliness, spreading these habits across social classes over time. The sensory environment of early modern Europe thus differed subtly from that of the Middle Ages. Herbs and incense remained, but distillations and perfumes added new layers of scent. Soap was more varied and widely available. Linen was more abundant. The decline of public baths did not mean the end of hygiene, but its transformation into something more private, domestic, and individualized. In this shift, we can see the gradual emergence of modern ideas of personal space, bodily care, and health. The story of medieval hygiene then does not end abruptly, but flows into the early modern period as part of a continuum. The fact of the bathhouse decline marks a cultural turning point. The lesser-known detail of perfumed waters shows innovation and adaptation. The unresolved mystery of how ordinary people lived these changes reminds us of the diversity of experience. The planetary scale of climate disease and global trade situates hygiene within larger forces shaping human history. To trace these shifts is to see how people across centuries responded to the challenges of cleanliness with creativity, persistence, and adaptation, ensuring that even as practices changed, the pursuit of freshness, health, and civility never disappeared.